Good afternoon. Excuse me. Caught whatever's going around, so this will be fun. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you today about building modern web applications with Remix. Who here has heard of the Remix web framework before we get started? Just as I expected, a handful of you. It's one of these frameworks that when I first saw it, I was like, oh wow, this is actually a direction that I think the web should be going. And so today, my goal is to really share with all of you how the Remix web framework will kind of get us back on track and remove some of the complexity in the web ecosystem, take us back to some of the fundamentals, and yeah. So my application that I'm going to be showing today is called Bardic Beats. It is a D&D inspired Spotify clone, and it's a really good example because it has the properties of a web application. You get to browse through various playlists, song lists, get artist information. They're kind of properties of a normal website, but then it is a full client application. So we want to play our music, we want to skip. If I'm navigating around the site, I want my song to keep playing. So it's it's a really good example of these like hybrid apps that we kind of were using single page applications to build, but Remix bridges the gap between our traditional web apps and the complexity of single page applications. A little bit about myself before we get started. As Michelle said, my name's Jake Ginnivan. You can hit me up on any of the socials. I am a principal consultant at a consultancy called Arkahna. We tend to focus more in the Azure space, but my focus there is kind of building internal product, IP, reusability, and making sure that we continue improving our consistency across all of our different engagements. I also help run D2D Perth, which is a large conference in Perth, community conference held on a Saturday. It's really, really cool. If you ever get over there, highly recommend. D2D Brisbane was here on Saturday. And recently I've just launched through Arkahna a product called Featureboard. So they're the things that I'm kind of focusing on at the moment. Before Arkahna, I worked at 7 West Media. My team and myself built thewest.com.au and Perth Now and finally 7news.com.au. So we really wanted to pick newer web technologies and push the bounds of what you're kind of used to with news stacks. If any of you have visited a news website without an ad blocker on, who's done that? Yeah, it's a terrible experience, right? So the problem with all of this advertising when free products is that there is a heap of JavaScript that has to be loaded, and then when you're navigating around the site, every page transition, you've got to load up a whole lot of JavaScript again. The browser's got to reparse that. So we wanted to kind of follow the way that Washington Post and New York Times had been going and build a web stack using React. There wasn't any Next.js at the time. There wasn't any kind of server-side rendering frameworks. It was all kind of vanilla React, and we built our own server-side rendering framework called Project Watchtower. And so building the server-side rendering stuff, understanding how we can load the data and then make sure we don't render too many times, and all these fun problems that you hit when building one of these frameworks, gave me a real appreciation for the problems that they're trying to solve. And that kind of gave me the perspective when Remix came along. I was like, that's kind of what I want. I'm not a huge fan of the complexity and the non-standard ways some of these other frameworks work. Before we go too much into Remix, I want to kind of take you on a journey of the web so far. There's really two types of web applications. We've got the multi-page web applications and single-page applications. It's a bit of a spectrum, so I'm oversimplifying it. But with your multi-page web applications, we load the page, click a link, and it loads another page. Each of these are essentially new instances of the page. there's a heap of really good properties about this type of application. As opposed to single-page applications, you launch an empty HTML page, and then it loads some CSS and JavaScript, and then the app boots up, and then it renders all client-side. So they're broadly the two types. Now, I find it really interesting. Why did we introduce all of the complexity that comes along with single-page web applications? Like, multi-page web applications have worked for years. They're incredibly scalable. They leverage some of the fundamentals of the web that have been around for a long time. So what ended up happening is our multi-page web applications, we started using a bit more JavaScript and started creating these enhanced pages. So if you visit a page, then a whole bunch of JavaScript loads. It gives you client-side navigation, like toggles forms on and off. Could be clients like Gmail, where you get a whole email browser, that sort of thing. We just kept creating more and more complexity here. So typical devs just threw more JavaScript at the problem. This is what ended up happening, unfortunately. But what was actually happening in reality is we were building two applications. The first application was our still multi-page web application. The second was a JavaScript application. So the first application's written in a back-end language, whatever your choice is, PHP. All it needed to do was be able to handle requests and render out a view. There was heaps of web frameworks in all the different programming languages. It has support for form validation. It renders HTML. The second application is written in JavaScript. It has form validation logic, often implemented twice. And the problem with this model is the second application is updating the HTML of the first application. This type of coupling between two applications there's nowhere else in the software development industry that you'd actually introduce purposefully this sort of coupling. And so it just really overcomplicated everything. But what single-page applications enabled us to do is if we dropped that server component, so now we just went to back one application, we could rapidly experiment with the web. And that's kind of why we introduced single-page applications, got rid of the server, but there's a heap of things that we needed to resolve. We left the platform behind. Things like URLs. So many single-page applications actually never update the URL, so you can't send your current page. Forms. The number of React form libraries out there is insane because you're introducing all of this client-side state that the browser used to manage for you. State management, we had cookies, we had local storage, we had all of these things that was built into the browser, and we had to build these again. SEO and accessibility, way, way worse in React applications. And I'm singling out React because that's been my predominant single-page application language, but most single-page application frameworks suffer from these problems. But the way I like to look at it is spas were actually a little bit of a detour for us. They allowed us to rapidly experiment with the web ecosystem. We experimented with build tools, how we could introduce hot module reloading, all sorts of CSS and JS and push the boundaries of all of these different tools. There was heaps and heaps of innovation there. For me, Remix takes us back a little bit, re-embraces the platform, and goes back to what we were trying to achieve with that multi-page, progressively enhanced application, but without a lot of the drawbacks. For those that haven't heard of Remix, it's actually backed by React Router. The team behind that is built on top of React Router, which is an incredibly popular open source framework. The guys behind React Router run a consulting business called React Training, and they did that for 7 or 8 years and did a heap of consulting around delivering applications, React applications. And finally, Shopify have become the stewards of Remix. A little while ago, they were building their own Hydrogen framework using React Server components, and then they kept looking at what the Remix team was doing, and they're like, let's just sponsor them so they can just keep working on it. So this kind of gives you a really good signal that it's not going to go away. Shopify have a really good reputation for just supporting open source in the long term, letting that project mature in its own way. And it gives you the certainty that if you pick it, it's going to be around for a while, because now if you do a new Shopify storefront, it will be built on top of Remix. So it's going to end up, its usage is going to just continue growing. So the best way I've heard Remix described is it is a center stack framework for React. What do I mean by that? Well, if I've got the browser and I've got my server, those two things need to talk. So I put in a URL, and the browser knows how to turn a URL into a request to my server. It then gets a bunch of HTML back. It understands the HTML. It understands hypermedia. So I can click on a link, and the browser knows that the hypermedia means I want to navigate to the next page. So I click on that link, and then it will update the URL. Because the URL is updated, the browser will go get that new page and return me some new HTML. That HTML might have a form on it. Notice there's no crazy form libraries. It's just needs a type and a name, and the form has a method. And so the browser understands that if I submit that form, I need to make a post to the same URL, or I can specify the action and post to a completely different URL. These are all built into the browser. Because of these standards and knowing how to jump that gap, all of the web frameworks knew how to parse the data that was serialized by the browser. These were all standards, so it was really, really easy to know what you were going to get in the back end from your front end. And then finally, you can return either some more HTML, or you can return a location header, and then the browser will follow that location and update to the final URL, which is a thanks, we'll be in touch shortly. So this is what the browser does for us, and that's really what the center stack is. It is the glue between your front end and your back end. The browser provides that center stack. Things like URLs, hypermedia, navigation, forms, state management. These are the things that the browser does for us. Now, when we talk about what Remix is, it is emulating what the browser does, because we want to progressively enhance this website. And if I navigate around, I want it to act like a normal web app, but do all these as client-side transitions using modern APIs if the JavaScript is loaded. So it's really designed to emulate what the browser does, cross the gap between your front end and your back end, and it's not really a front-end framework, and it's not a back-end framework. A lot of these larger JavaScript web applications, they know how to connect to a database and have these concerns. With Remix, it just gets you to your server, and then you can make an API call to another service in another language that is far more scalable than JavaScript. So it enables a lot of really flexible options there. So really all Remix is it is a browser emulator, a really, really fancy browser emulator. But why do we want this? Well, there's a couple of things. Server code is so much easier to write than client code. As soon as you have state that needs to be managed over time, complexity grows. And so HTTP requests come in, they're basically pure functions that have a request, they make, not quite, but make a database query, and then they return the result. So, but they don't persist state between those requests unless you know how to look up that state based on the inputs. It's also been built over many, many years. And this is why I said single page applications enabled us to really rapidly experiment, because you don't want to experiment with the browser, because if we experiment with the browser, we all have to live with it forever. We don't want to break that platform. It's kind of the guarantee of JavaScript with the web is your websites that you created 20 years ago will still run now. And the web and browsers are massively scalable. HTTP solves caching and a whole bunch of other things. It's accessible by default and it's reasonably secure. Browsers, they enforce the security model for you. So it's kind of the model that we want. But I don't just want to build websites. I want to build web apps. So I want to build my website and then enhance it without having to build two applications. I also don't want to write React code at nearly as much. If I'm just showing a form or rendering a page, why do I need state? Why do I have to handle all of this complexity? I just want the same model that I used to have. So let's jump into it. The first concept that I really want to cover is routing. It's the first kind of important concept to understand. So this is Bardic Beats. It is URL based, so you can see playlist/ID/artist and then another ID, and that renders the playlist, but it also renders artist information. How does that actually break down? Well, we have a root component that is the layout for our entire application. So that includes the sidebar, all of the auth bits up the top for our top bar. I then go down to the next level, and it is a nested route, and that is playlist.id. Remix has file system-based routing that will match part of the path and match it down to the file system routes. So playlist.$id matches to playlist/ID, parameterized. And finally, the last bit is another nested route, which is artist/ID. The routing is file-based. You don't have to, but I'm going to go through file-based routing. There's a couple of really simple conventions. Underscores make that file name, or that segment of the file name, invisible to the URL. So _player._index, that will match the root URL. Remix will warn you if logically you have two routes that conflict. I can then also go _player.library. Now this is really useful because _player, I can introduce a layout component that's shared between those. So I don't have to share between auth routes and a whole bunch of other things. So you just keep building this out and continuing on with nested routes at each of these different levels. But you can see here that I can introduce API.play, and that matches API.play or /play in terms of the URL. That's where that _player comes in, that it's the layout for all of the UI components that I want, because I don't want to render my sidebar and top bar for my API routes or my auth callbacks or any of that sort of stuff. So that's the first concept, is this file system-based routing, and it is pluggable. So you can either define it in code, or there's plenty of third-party libraries that have different layouts if you would like. The next thing is the data fetching cycle. So there's three main parts involved in data fetching in Remix. First, a route has a loader, and that runs on the server as the request comes in. If you're used to ASP.NET, that's kind of like your controller action. And then once that returns some data, Remix will render the component for that route, and you can access the data from the loader in the component. That then goes back to the client, and it's server-side rendered. What's really interesting is if that was a client-side navigation, Remix will use RPC and call your server to invoke the loader, send the loader data back via JSON over the wire as an API, like an RPC API call, and then your component can use that. So it's really, really flexible, and it kind of gives you that multi-model. Either it can be done as a traditional web application or a single page application. The model is exactly the same for you. Finally, we have actions. If I submit a form, that is the thing that handles post requests and put requests on the server, and you either return some HTML or data or a new location or a redirect. So this is kind of the cycle, and it kind of guarantees that it doesn't really matter if you are client-side or server-side. Your loaders and actions will always run on the server. They'll never run on the client. Your components will be rendered either on the server or on the client, whichever makes sense based on where you are and navigating. And this is what it looks like. We just have a module, and that's the route module. I export the loader. That loader can get access to HTTP requests, all the headers, everything that we're used to, and it can return a response. That response can have a status code, it can have headers, it could do specify caching headers, for instance, to enable you to leverage the browser's cache. You then have a default function export. This is your React component. And finally, I have my action that can handle my put and post requests. Now these two, the loaders and the actions, always run on the server. So if I'm doing a client-side navigation or a client-side form submission, it will make an RPC call to Remix, and Remix will route it to the appropriate loader. So that's pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is jump into Bardic Beats and show you this search route and a bit of the data fetching. So here we have, I'm going to have to revoke that now. So we have various different routes. We've seen that here. We've got our different like playlist create, playlist ID, those sort of things. We have a playlist search route. If I'm going to jump into Bardic Beats, this is my search route here, and I can search for, what's a Brisbane band? Huh? Powderfinger. So I can search that, and then I get my search results. Now, what's really cool about this is I can navigate around, go into the different playlists. This is just hitting the Spotify API behind the scenes. All of this is working with JavaScript disabled in the browser. So it is just a traditional web application using the normal request response. This is a multi-page application. If I re-enable JavaScript and then search again, I might have to refresh. You can see that I get like the single page application where it updates the state. So that's pretty nifty. What does that actually look like? There's a few bits that make this work. As I said, there's the loader. The loader does things like ensuring that the request is authenticated. So grabbing out, making sure that there's a session, initializing the Spotify SDK based on that session. It grabs the URL out of the query string, and then it makes an API call to Spotify to search for tracks, playlists, artists, that sort of stuff. Finally, I return my JSON to the client. I then have this in my React component here. I have this hook called useLoaderData. Now useLoaderData, I use TypeScript to say this is type of loader. And if I hover over that, you can see that the type is understands what's been sent from the server. It also does things, really clever things, like dates moving from the client to the server. Sorry, other way around, server to the clients will always be serialized as strings. So the types will do that for you. And you get type safety from your APIs across. So if you're using an SDK, you're noticing here, this is all the types coming from the Spotify SDK. they flow all the way to the client, and I don't have to explicitly type anything. This makes Remix really, really good for prototyping because you don't have to create your API contracts, generate a client for the server, a client from your server contracts, and then and then try and worry about that contract between the client and the server. What we do is just, if I redeploy, reload the application because the version's changed, and off we go. So it kind of is a really, really good way to just rapidly iterate. Great for building out prototypes, that sort of stuff. But it can scale to all of my backends, just like I'm calling the Spotify API here. I could be calling my own backend APIs that are using event sourcing or any of the cool techniques that we've seen at YOW over this conference. I then can get the use navigation, and I can see that if it is navigating, it gives me the location that I'm navigating to. So this is kind of this progressive enhancement. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to an action. And what I need to do is be able to, instead of doing a GET request that puts the question mark Q equals as a GET request, I'm going to make it a POST to update so you can see both. We still need a loader. And instead of this URL, what I'll do instead is grab the action functions arg, and then I can go const query equals request dot form data. Now you notice, if you're familiar with the web in general, and fetch, what's been happening over the last couple of years is we've been moving away from custom libraries like Request and Axios to introduce standard libraries like the Fetch API to JavaScript. Remix is built on all of those standards. So as a side effect of just using Remix, you will learn the web stack more, which makes it quite good for not having that vendor lock-in and just not learning all the specifics of the framework. Cool. That all looks good. Instead of use loader data, I'm going to go use action data. And this allows you to return data from your action. And you can see that the types all flow through. So that's pretty nifty. All of this can stay the same. I can't provide the default value anymore. And I'm just going to change the method of this to a post. I'm just going to have to kill this. I'll tell you why later. Okay, cool. So you can see, oops, I'll remove the search. You can see here that it's not updating the URL, it's just using a post instead, and we still get the single page application. So that's kind of the data fetching model for Remix. You can also see here that if I jump in, this is actually a full-blown Spotify client. I'll share the link later, but I can, if I transfer the playback, it is a full-blown client. So there's quite a few bits of data that we're loading here. I'm loading all the playlist data. I'm loading some user data up the top. I'm loading information about the artist, and I'm also loading the artist's top tracks. The really nice thing about this is it gives us some performance improvements as well, and we're going to jump in. So a single page application, you load, we saw that white page earlier. We load the HTML first. It needs to download, parse, and then it will trigger the loading of the CSS, JavaScript, fonts, that sort of stuff, static assets. Finally, it will make an API call to go get the data around like, who's the user that's logged in? And then once it's got that, it'll make further API calls to fetch more data. You can see this in Twitter. If you go to Twitter now, you start with a spinner, and then you get 2 spinners, and then you get more spinners, and it's about 7 cascading spinners. And this is because of the single page application approach. You can't render the child until you get the data of the parent. What Remix allows us to do is move those initial API calls to the server. And so we kick that off and then send the data back with the HTML. So your initial time to first byte does slow down, but the full page with useful user data speeds up quite a bit. So what's really nifty about this is if we want to do progressive enhancement, for instance, I will jump in a second, but I'll demonstrate when I load the artist panel, it's really slow. Like I click, it's a really crappy user experience. So what I'm going to do is fix that. Ideally, you can just make your backend fast. That's the best way to fix any web application. But ideally, like sometimes we can't. We don't support, like we don't control that backend API, or it's too expensive to fix, or whatever the reasons are. So we are going to work around it by just creating a better user experience. I'll quickly demonstrate what the problem is. So if we jump in here and go into Hot Hits Australia, and then click on Jack Harlow, waiting. Bet Spotify's like died on me or something. Let's figure out what the problem is. Okay, so this is my nested artist, and this is my playlist. So the way that we display child routes, as you can see, I'm not actually getting that panel, is I render a specific component called the outlet component. And an outlet just allows a route to render child routes. So I'm going to chuck this into here. Now, if I click on Jack or whatever, you can see it's pretty slow. So click on Beyonce, finally loads. Really, really slow. It's a pretty crappy user experience. This is supposed to be a single page or like app experience. So what's happening? Well, in here, I've got a really slow API call that's getting the tracks. What we're going to do, and this is where you get some really, really nifty levers inside Remix, is we can go instead of just rendering the outlet, I can render navigation.location, as we saw before. So path name, so this is if I'm navigating to this path, and the path starts with so if the path name starts with playlist/playlist ID/artist, so I'm going to that nested child route, I will render a div class name equals artist description or detail style. Then finally, I will render a loading ... Otherwise, I'll render the outlet. So what I'm trying to do here is, which I've got something wrong somewhere, which I will spot in a sec after I explain it. What I'm trying to do is, if I'm navigating, show a loading, like bit of loading text so I can see that I'm navigating to that next page, just to give the user an idea that something is happening. Cool. So over here, now if I click Paul Russell, I get a loading, and then it loads in. So that's pretty cool. We've now kind of started this progressive enhancement, but we can do better than this with Remix. Remix just gives you a whole bunch of different tools. One of the really nifty features is if I, instead of returning JSON in this, I can return a defer instead. Now, a defer allows us to, come on, why are you not, anyway. A defer allows us to return a promise over the wire instead of data. So if I go top tracks and remove this await, you can see top tracks is now just a promise of the top track results. This obviously doesn't work down here. So I can render a suspense boundary. So suspense is a new technology inside React 18 that allows you to kind of load data and gives kind of React an understanding of what data is loading. So we can provide a fallback component if any children under the suspense boundary is loading. I can then use an await component, and I say I'm resolving my top tracks. And I move this all up. As a function, so the await component will only render its children once that promise has resolved. And I'm missing my close for the suspense. Okay, so a pretty minimal change, and it's allowed me to return a promise over the wire. Now that's slightly different because previously, without that, if I refreshed that page, I would get a delay that page load. Now, if I refresh, you'll notice the top tracks are actually in a loading state for the server-side render. I'll show you why that's important. So this was our waterfall of everything happening before. You'll notice that we are slowed down rendering anything because of that really big, slow request. So if we do the optimistic UI, what that allows us to do is pull that in, but only for client-side navigations. We're still slow on the server, that initial page load. By using defer, that allows us to pass the promise across the wire, and then Remix takes care of streaming the result across. So that's pretty nifty. So really, like Remix is two things now. It's a browser emulator, but it's really just a toolbox that gives you all of these tools to create a fully dynamic UI by progressively enhancing what the browser has. There's a couple of things that I want to cover before we wrap up. The first one is Vite. So Vite is a build tool that's come out relatively recently, and it replaces tools like Webpack. It's extremely fast because it really leans into the ESM side of things. If you're aware of ESM, is the new JavaScript bundle format. At the moment, Remix has its own compiler and it is its own web framework. The nifty thing about where it's moving is Remix is becoming just a Vite plugin rather than its own closed compiler that you can't extend. So that's the first thing that in terms of where Remix is going. The second thing is around React server components. If you have been watching X recently, like the Next.js conf, for instance, you would have seen a heap of talk around React server components. Remix is far less bullish than Vercel around React server components, but you will see more and more React server components inside Remix as they stabilize. The first thing that they're going to do is allow you to return React components on the server to the client. So inside your loader, I can return a React component that will serialize on the server, send it across to the client, and then I can just render that component on the client. What's really cool about this is you don't have any of that, like JavaScript for that component isn't in your client bundle. All of that stays on the server. So that's really, really cool when, say, you're rendering Markdown into React. It's a real pain because you have to either pass HTML across and dangerously set inner HTML and all those sort of hacks to make it scale. This is a really nifty way to kind of get around that. There's going to be a lot of extra React server components. The Remix team are expanding the APIs over time so they can, once all of these things are stable, they'll start collapsing. And the way they do that is with these future flags. So future flags allow you to opt in to breaking changes. So at the moment, Remix is V2, and you can opt in to a feature called Fetcher Persist, and then it is a breaking change, but it allows you to opt in to every breaking change over time and gives you a couple of months lead up. So when V3 gets released, you just upgrade. There's no breaking changes. You've already made all of the breaking changes, reducing your risk. So as they add these different APIs and those APIs come in to React and React server components or server actions, solve the problem that Remix first-class APIs already have, you'll be able to opt into that and start using the new way. If you'd like to look at Bardic Beats, that is the GitHub URL. I'll share the slides after. And I really encourage you to just have a look at the quick start and play with Remix. There's a heap of cool tutorials on the optimistic UI and all of these problems that are really, really difficult to solve. Like Remix, if you submit a form and then navigate, it'll try and cancel that request, just like the browser does. It handles all sorts of concurrency problems that you don't realize are there. The team make a huge amount of effort to solve these really hard problems that just make it quite amazing to use. One of the, I should have added it here, but there's a bunch of Remix singles, they're called, that Ryan Florence does, and he records these 5 to 10 minute clips. He's recently been building a Trello clone, and one of the things that are quite challenging is if I'm adding a task and then while that's creating, I'm moving it to another column, for instance, there's a heap of in-flight requests. Dealing with all of that is very, very hard. Remix does it extremely well and elegantly. The APIs are very, very well thought out. So that's been building modern web applications with Remix. We've got some time for questions, so hit me up.